अनुसुतदेवे प्रणमामि हरिप्रिय वाञ्छाकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपासिन्धुभ्य एव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः। जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्तवृंद। हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Okay, so we were discussing the 6th chapter, and I believe we have to start from verse number 11 and 12. So I'll share my screen. Okay, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, Prabhuji.
Okay, so let's recite this verse. You can repeat after me. Shuchau deshe pratisthapya
Shuchau deshe pratisthapya
stiramasama atmanaha
stiram asanam atmanaha
natyau shritam nati nicham
natyau shritam nati nicham
chailajina kushottaram
shailajina kushottaram
tatraikagram manah kritva
tatraikagram manah kritva
yata chitendriya kriyaha
yata chitendriya kriyaha
upavishyasane yunjyad
upavishyasane yunjad
yogam atma vishuddhaye
yogam atma vishuddhaye
शुचौ देशे प्रतिष्ठाप्य
shuchau deshe pratisthapya
स्थिरमासनमात्मनः
stiram asanam atmanaha
नात्यौ श्रितं नाति नीचं
natyau shritam nati nicham
चैलाजिनाकुशोत्तरम्
shailajina kushottaram
तत्रैकाग्रं मनः कृत्वा
tatraikagram manah kritva
यथा चितेन्द्रियक्रियः
yata chitendriya kriyaha
उपविश्यासने युञ्ज्याद्
upavishyasane yunjad
योगम् आत्मविशुद्धये।
yogam atma vishuddhaye
Anyone else would like to recite?
शुचौ देशे प्रतिस्थाप्य
शुचौ देशे प्रतिष्ठाप्य
स्थिरमासनमात्मनः
स्थिरमासनमात्मनः
नात्युच्छ्रितं नाति नीचं
नात्युश्रितं नाति नीचं
चैलाजिनाकुशोत्तरम्
चैलाजिनाकुशोत्तरम्
तत्रैकाग्रं मनः कृत्वा
तत्रैकाग्रं मनः कृत्वा
यथा चित्तेन्द्रियक्रियः
यथा चित्तेन्द्रियक्रियः
उपवेश्यासने युञ्ज्याद्
उपविश्यासने युञ्ज्यात्
योगमात्मविशुद्धये
योगम् आत्मविशुद्धये।
शुचौ देशे प्रतिष्ठाप्य
शुचौ देशे प्रतिष्ठाप्य
स्थिरमासनमात्मनः
स्थिरम् आसनमात्मनः
नात्युश्रितं नाति नीचं
नात्युश्रितं नाति नीचं
चैलाजिनः कुशोत्तरम्
चैलाजिनाकुशोत्तरम्
तत्रैकाग्रं मनः कृत्वा
तत्रैकाग्रं मनः कृत्वा
यतः चित्तेन्द्रियक्रियः
यथा चितेन्द्रियक्रियः
उपविश्यासने युञ्ज्यात्
उपविश्यासने युञ्ज्यात्
योगम् आत्मविशुद्धये
योगम् आत्मविशुद्धये। Anyone else? Okay, let's recite the synonyms. Shuchau,
शुचौ
in a sanctified. Deshe,
देशे
land.
land
Pratisthapya,
प्रतिष्ठाप्य
placing.
placing
Sthiram,
स्थिरं
firm.
firm
Asanam,
आसनं
आसनं
seat.
seat
Atmanah,
Atmanah.
his own,
His own.
na,
Na.
not,
Not.
ati,
Ati.
tu,
Tu.
ushritam,
Ushritam.
high,
High.
na,
Na.
nor,
Nor.
ati,
Ati.
tu,
Tu.
nicham,
Nicham.
low,
Low.
jailajina,
Jailajana.
of soft cloth and deer skin,
Of soft cloth and their skin.
kusha
Kusha.
and kusha grass,
And kusha grass.
uttaram,
Uttaram.
covering,
Covering.
tatra,
Tatra.
thereupon,
Thereupon.
ekagram,
Ekagram.
with one attention,
With one attention.
manaha,
Manaha.
mind,
Mind.
kritva,
Ritva.
making,
Making.
yat chitta,
Yat chitta.
controlling the mind,
Controlling the mind.
indriya,
Indriya.
senses,
Senses.
kriyaha,
Kriyaha.
and activities,
And activities.
upavishya,
Upavishya.
sitting,
Sitting.
asane,
Ashane.
on the seat,
On the seat.
yunjyat,
Yunjya.
should execute,
Should execute.
yogam,
Yogam.
yoga practice,
Yoga practice.
atma,
Atma.
the heart,
The heart.
vishuddhaye,
Vishuddhaya.
for clarifying.
For clarifying.
Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. To practice yoga, one should go to a secluded place and should lay kusha grass on the ground and then cover it with a deer skin and a soft cloth. The seat should be neither too high nor too low and should be situated in a sacred place. The yogi should then sit on it very firmly and practice yoga to purify the heart by controlling his mind, senses, and activities and fixing the mind on one point. Purport. Sacred place refers to places of pilgrimage. In India, the yogis, the transcendentalists, or the devotees all leave home and reside in sacred places such as Prayag, Mathura, Vrindavan, Rishikesh, and Haridwar, and in solitude practice yoga, where the sacred rivers like the Yamuna and the Ganges flow. But often this is not possible, especially for Westerners. The so-called yoga societies in big cities may be successful in earning material benefit, but they are not at all suitable for the actual practice of yoga. One who is not self-controlled and whose mind is not undisturbed cannot practice meditation. Therefore, in the Brahan Naradiya Puran, it is said that in Kali Yuga, the present Yuga or age, when people in general are short-lived, slow in spiritual realization, and always disturbed by various anxieties, the best means of spiritual realization is chanting the holy name of the Lord. Harer Nam, Harer Nam, Harer Nam eva kevalam, kalau nasti ev, nasti ev gatiranyatha. In this age of quarrel and hypocrisy, the only means of deliverance is chanting the holy name of the Lord. There is no other way. There is no other way. There is no other way. Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. I read the translation one more time. To practice yoga, one should go to a secluded place and should lay kusha grass on the ground and then cover it with a deer skin and a soft cloth. The seat should be neither too high nor too low and should be situated in a sacred place. The yogi should then sit on it very firmly and practice yoga to purify the heart by controlling his mind, senses, and activities and fixing the mind on one point. So we are discussing the 11th and 12th verses of the 6th chapter. Now, interestingly, Krishna here is saying that the yogi should go to a secluded place. Shuchau Deshe, it should be a sacred place and a secluded place. Prabhupada also writes that in the purport. So now it's interesting that in the beginning of the chapter itself, Krishna had said that don't take sannyas, but here when you have to go to a secluded place, that it means is that, basically you have to take sannyas. You have to go away from the material world, from, active world, and go to a secluded sacred place, and there you practice yoga. So how do we understand this? So actually, if you remember, there is a qualification of taking sannyas was also mentioned right in this chapter in the beginning. Anyone remembers what was the qualification that was mentioned by Krishna? Who is qualified to take sannyas? In this chapter itself, Krishna says that. Okay. So we'll come to that. So now let me give a little context about what's happening here, and why suddenly Krishna is asking Arjuna, not Arjuna, but he's just describing the process of Dhyana Yoga, and where he starts talking about going to a secluded place. So in the beginning itself, Krishna had said that, he had not encouraged sannyas. In a sense, he says, anashritah karma phalam karyam karma karoti ha sa sannyasi cha yogi cha na niragnir na cha kriya. He says that actually, person who doesn't take shelter of his fruit, but yet he does karma, yet he does work, such a person is a sannyasi and a yogi, not a person who doesn't light any fire and who doesn't do any work. So that's how Krishna had explained right in the first verse of the 6th chapter. So there it refers to basically karma yogis. Such a person is both a sannyasi and a yogi. So how could he be a sannyasi and a yogi? So basically, sannyas means to detach from matter. Basically we take our consciousness away from the matter. That is sannyas. And yoga means to connect with the supreme. That is connectedness with the supreme. So in one sense, both are the same. If we have to take our consciousness, our attachments away from the matter, then we have to actually focus it somewhere. And that somewhere is the beyond matter. What is left beyond matter? We have either we have Brahman, or we have Paramatma, or we have Bhagwan. Only these three possibilities are there. There is no fourth possibility beyond matter. So that's how Krishna had put that actually such a person who doesn't take shelter of his fruits, yet he does work. Such a person is a sannyasi and a yogi. And then Krishna also says in the 2nd verse, he says, Yam sannyasam iti prahur yogam tam vidhi pandava. Actually he says he equates the two. What is called as renunciation is also called as yoga, or linking with the supreme. So he actually equates the two. He doesn't distinguish between the two. Now the qualification of who can take sannyas, that comes in the 3rd verse. So arurukshar muner yogam karma karanam uchyate yoga arudhasya tasyeva shamaha karanam uchyate. So he introduces 2 terms, aruruksha and yoga rudha. So aruruksha is a practitioner who is trying to become perfect. He is like a sadhaka, like us. So all of us are sadhakas in the bhakti yoga path. And yoga rudha is a person who has perfected. So actually Krishna says that for araruksha, person who is still a practitioner, for him work is said to be the means. So basically he should not give up work. And one who is already situated in yoga rudha means who is situated in yoga. So like we say for Vishnu, we say Garuda Rudha. Lord Vishnu is Garuda Rudha, means he's situated on Garuda. So person who has perfected, he can take sannyas. Cessation of all material activities is said to be the means. Shamaha karanam uchyate. So that is the qualification of who can take sannyas. Now, so the acharyas explain that, so we know that there are 8 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga. We have Yam, Niyam, Asan, Pranayam. Then we have, what is the 5th stage? Pratyahar, thank you. Pratyahar, Dharana, Dhyan and Samadhi. So these are the 8 stages. So the first 4 have to be followed even when one is acting in this world. So for basically in the 5th chapter, Krishna had talked about karma yogi, and from the karma yogi to elevate further, he had talked about 2 different paths. He talked about the Ashtanga Yoga process, and he talked about the Bhakti Yoga process. So here he is elaborating more on the Ashtanga Yoga or Dhyana Yoga process. So the acharyas explain that when a karma yogi is still acting in the world, now karma yoga also we have to understand what does it mean. So karma kand means sense gratification according to the prescription of the Vedic scriptures, and that is karma kand. But karma yoga means giving up all material desires, giving up all sense gratification, not even with the prescription of the, not even according to the Vedic scriptures, just give up all sense gratification. That is karma yoga. So when a karmi yogi, when he is still acting in the world, he can start following the four primary stages, which is yam, niyam, asan, pranayam. We'll discuss about yam and niyam a little later. We'll talk about what are the 5 yamas, what are the 5 niyamas, and what is the benefit Patanjali talks about in his Patanjali Yoga Sutras about the benefits of following the yama and niyama. So we'll discuss that a little later, but the acharyas explain that after one becomes qualified in the first floor, and then when one is when one is getting ready to do pratyahar, in a sense, when it is ready for shutting out all the senses. Pratyahar means shut out all the external senses, just detach completely from sense objects. So it's not easy. We have to, even on the bhakti yoga path, we need sense objects. We can't completely shut out from the sense objects. Now, of course, there are elevated devotees who are pure devotees they can do it, but at our stage, it's very difficult. So when a person is becoming ready for pratyahar, at that time, he can go to a secluded place, and then he can follow this the further things that are mentioned from the 11th verse onwards. So 11th verse onwards, actually 10th verse onwards, Krishna starts talking about how the Ashtanga yoga process is done. So basically, what is the progress from a sadhaka stage to a siddha stage. That's how he'll progress. So pratyahar onwards, when he's ready for pratyahar, then he can go and he can actually go to a secluded place. Now we understand, even Prabhupada also writes it at several places, even in the Srimad Bhagavatam, that for a yogi and for jnani, there is not much of association. They have to follow their paths individually, on their own, so that the idea of sangha doesn't come over there. They have to be secluded, they have to be alone, and for jnanis it is all the way more important. For yogis, sometimes they have certain group of yogis who can be together and help each other, and so, but for jnanis it is very, very important. Prabhupada also writes at several places about this. So, but the problem is, even if they are alone, they still have one association, and that one association is the association of their own minds. And therefore we see that in the 6th chapter, the underlying theme is control of the mind. So many times the word mind comes, and just the word mind doesn't just come alone. It comes with controlling the mind, conquering the mind, defeating the mind, like that Krishna puts it at several places. Just count the number of times Krishna used the word mind. You'll understand that the underlying theme is all about mind. So the mind control is of the essence over here. Later, Krishna also says that one who has conquered the mind, for him the super soul is already reached. So he is already, so basically the whole idea is how to conquer the mind. That is the idea in the Ashtanga Yoga. Now we understand that it's not very easy, at least in this age, and that's what Srila Prabhupada is also writing in the purport for the 11th and 12th verses. So therefore, we have to make our mind attached to Krishna. We'll talk about it later. But so here Krishna actually establishes who is qualified to take sannyas, and then Krishna also talks about that basically what exactly yoga means. Sarva sankalpa sannyasi yoga rudhas tadochyate. Basically, one who gives up desire for sense gratification, not the activity itself. Sarva sankalpa sannyasi, giving up material desires, is such a person can become yoga rudha. So not necessarily activity itself, but actually the desire for there are different kinds of sense gratification. So we say that Krishna is full in 6 opulences, and the desire for attaining those 6 opulences ourselves, that also means the desire for sense gratification. And then Krishna talks about, then the theme of mind control comes very prominently. Uddhared atmanatmanam natmanam avasadayet atmaiva hi atmanor bandhur atmaiva ripur atmanaha. So many times atmana come. So atma doesn't just mean self. Atma has many different meanings. So Prabhupada actually translates it very expertly. One should deliver himself with the help of the mind, and one should not degrade himself. The mind is the friend of the conditioned soul. Basically, the mind is the friend of the self. Soul means the self, and his enemy as well. And then comes the very frightening verse, which is the 6th verse of the 6th chapter. Bandhuratmatmanastasya yenatmaivatmana jitaha anatmanastu shatrutve vartetatmaiva shatruvat. So for him who has conquered the mind is the best of friends. But for who has failed to do so, his mind will remain the greatest enemy. So this is like a frightening verse in the 6th chapter. How could our mind be our own enemy? And here we understand that actually, so here Krishna in one sense is personifying the mind. Now, we understand that mind is just matter, it is dead. But Krishna is talking of mind as a person. The mind is our friend. It can be our friend, it can be our enemy also. So this personification of mind, so actually what mind is, it is just certain default scripts, based on our prior activities, based on our prior preferences, our prior choices. And when I say prior, it's not just for this life. It basically, they are from different various lives. Even, we might have taken some animal lives also, even from those lives. So the mind has acquired certain impressions. So anytime we have indulged in sense gratification, what happens is there is an impression that is created on the mind, and that gets registered. So mind is it is like a default script that is running all the time, and then basically it tells us what to do and what not to do. Basically not just tells us, it forces us in a way, so it corners us at times. And even if we try to push the mind, it pushes us back, and then it forces us, no, you do this. Sometimes we see that we want to get up early in the morning, we want to chant, but we just can't get up. The mind tells us, why are you getting up so early? You have not slept, so you slept so late, you need some rest. Just relax, just snooze your alarm and just let it just wait for 10 more minutes, 10 more minutes, 10 more minutes, and like that 1 hour is gone. So what the mind does is it basically chooses the path of the easiest path, basically, where there is no resistance, the path of least resistance, I should say. That is the path that mind chooses. Now, how does the mind become enemy and the friend? So Acharya explained that if we have controlled the mind in a sense that we don't indulge in sense gratification, when we try to starve out the desire for sense gratification, at that time the mind can become our friend. But as long as we are indulging in sense gratification, we have desires, fresh desire, burning desires for indulging in sense gratification. Until that time, the mind will remain our greatest enemy. So what happens is, when we personify the mind, basically we hear out our mind. That is the biggest challenge. The mind is constantly with us, and it is constantly playing that broken record of sense gratification. Do this, do that. Here you get pleasure. Here you will get pleasure. But actually, you don't actually get any pleasure. There might be some minute temporary pleasure. So in the Sri Sampradaya, they have an analogy for understanding, how mind works, and how it degrades us. So they take the analogy of Ramayana. So they say that just like the pastime of Manthara and Kaikeyi, how they had exiled Lord Ram. So they explain that the Kaikeyi is like our heart is like Ayodhya. The Kaikeyi is like the living entity, and Manthara is like the mind. So what we do is, we think that the Lord is our enemy. He's enemy. He doesn't want us to do sense gratification, and we exile the Lord from our heart. That's exactly what Manthara and Kaikeyi do. So the Sri Sampradaya Acharya explain that actually, if you look at the whole pastime of this, Kaikeyi made two mistakes. First is she actually heard submissively from Manthara. So initially, when Manthara comes and informs Kaikeyi that King Dashrath have decided to do the coronation of Lord Ram, and at that time, Kaikeyi, she becomes so joyful. So she actually gives her her necklace to Manthara, and then, what a good news you have brought for me. Just take this. And Manthara, she just takes it and just threw it on the ground, and they said, what a stupid lady you are. You don't understand what's happening here. So, and then she starts her poisoning session. And then, initially, Kaikeyi was not believing anything. She was not ready to believe. Just stop your nonsense. I don't want to hear this. But mantra was going on and on, just like our mind. The mind also keeps repeating, do this, do this, do this, do this. But and we can, through our intelligence, we can push back for a certain time. But there are then there are those instances where we just can't resist the mind anymore, and then we give in to the temptations. So what happened is, so she uses one of the arguments. She uses, okay, if Dashrath has all good intentions, why is he doing the coronation when your son is not here? He has sent your son away to his maternal grandfather's house, and now he is doing it in absence of your son. What is so much hurry? What is the need of doing it right now? He could have waited for Bharat to return. And that one point, it catches Kaikai. She also starts thinking that, yes, that this makes sense. Why did, Dashrath do this? He could have waited for so long. Bharat loves Ram so much, and he would have been so happy. And that one point, after she catches Kaikai's attention, then she starts her poison feeding session. And by the time the poison feeding session ends, Kaikai is completely turned around. She is completely in the hands of Manthara. And then she actually goes, and then we know what happens. She puts her demands in front of Dashrath, and then Dashrath becomes so angry, and when even Lord Ram comes, and Kaikai is actually so blatant, she has become desensitized to everything else, and she actually doesn't fully comprehend what is going to happen later. But he kind of destroys the whole kingdom in one sense. Ram is exiled, and Dashrath Maharaj passes away in the grief of of Lord Ram, and Bharat also disowns Kaikai. So her whole world collapses, just because she heard mantra. So when Lord Ram comes, so Dashrath Maharaj, he says that actually Ram, I will also come with you, and not only me, our whole treasury will come, and our whole army will also come. We'll make the forest into a city, and we'll make the city into a forest, and let this Kaikai rule the forest with his son Bharat. And when Kaikai hears this, she becomes really angry, and she says that, you had promised me a flourishing kingdom, you are not going to do anything like that. I need the kingdom. I don't need a forest to rule. And when Dashrath Maharaj, when he hears this, he just faints, he just can't sustain. And then eventually Lord Ram reaps, and then Dashrath Maharaj also passes away. And when Bharat comes back, and then usually when Bharat and Shatrughan would come back, first Ram and Lakshman would welcome them, and the mothers would welcome them, and eventually Dashrath will also come and welcome them. But on that day, nothing like that happened, and they could sense that there is something that is not right. Is some inauspicious signs which are there. And then he meets his mother, and then he asks, "Where is my father?" So she says, "Actually, your father has gone to the abode from where nobody comes back." And then he is so morose, he's just devastated. He starts crying, and then after he gathers himself back, he asks, okay, there would have been some last instructions given by my father for me. What were the last instructions? What were the last words that he spoke? So she says that his last words were, "Oh Ram, oh Sita, how fortunate would those be who have, who would get a chance to see you." So then he just can't understand, it doesn't make any sense to him. Where were Sita and Ram when this happened? Were they not here at that time? And then Kaikai tells the whole thing, that how these people have made a conspiracy to dethrone you, take away your rightful share of the kingdom. And, I actually saved it. I saved the day for you. And when Bharat hears this, he's completely horrified, just hearing, he says, "You have done nothing for me. You have done everything for your own selfish interests." And he says that if you would have been not my mother, I would have killed you. But because you are a woman, I can't kill you, but I disown you as my mother. And then it is mentioned in the Ramayana that actually after that, for the entire 14 years, Bharat doesn't call Kaikai as mother. He calls Kaikai as Queen Kaikai. So at times Kaikai would tell, "I am your mother." So he would say that my mother was a very loving lady, but Queen Kaikai killed my mother. So her whole world collapses actually. So this same analogy is used by the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas, and they say that this is what actually mind does to us. We just don't realize how the mind is poisoning us, and the mind is taking us away. So what happens is, every time when we indulge in sense gratification, our mind become rajasic. Rajasic in the sense it becomes too passionate. The passion, it burns. So the lust, as it Krishna also says that lust burns like a wildfire, and it doesn't get satisfied. The more you put fuel, basically the more you do sense gratification, the more it burns, the more stronger it gets. In the Bhagavatam there is a verse that comes. So it says that actually the habits of sense gratification, it doesn't grow old. Generally when we as the time passes, we grow old, that body deteriorates. But the Bhagavatam describes that actually the desire for sense gratification, the habit of sense gratification, it doesn't grow old. On the contrary, it becomes stronger and stronger. So then it is, so we have the saying also that the old habits die hard. Basically, the older a habit is, the older we have been doing something, it's very difficult to give it up. The more difficult to give it up. So like that. So our acharyas have also, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, for example, he had very, he had been very sarcastic about the mind. He would say that our biggest non-devotee association is our mind. And he would also say that in the morning we should beat our mind with a broomstick. At the night we should beat our mind with a footwear. So that doesn't mean that we should literally pick it up and start beating, but basically very graphically the acharyas have told us the insidious nature of the mind. The mind is extremely insidious. How the mind will catch us and how it will lead us to the path of destruction will not just realize. It is especially all the way more important for people who are on the spiritual path. For people who are determined to do sense gratification, for them it doesn't matter. For them, their mind, they think that their mind is their best friend, but actually we understand it's not. But people who are actually on the path of sense gratification, spiritual realization, on the path of self-realization, they should be aware of the nature of the mind. So this chapter we see that actually Krishna focuses on the theme of mind control. And then he actually goes to an extent and say that actually the mind is the greatest enemy on the path of self-realization. There is no other greater enemy than the mind itself. So this has to be understood very clearly. And in this chapter, one of the specialty of this chapter is Krishna speaks elaborately about the process of sadhana, how the sadhana is to be done. And in no other chapter, Srila Prabhupada also focuses so much on how the sadhana is to be performed. He writes a lot about sadhana. And all these principles that are mentioned in the 6th chapter, although this chapter talks about the process of Dhyana Yoga, but all these principles in a sense also apply to Bhakti Yoga, to our path also. So we'll see how it applies. Later we can try to draw some comparison. Of course, there are rough parallels. There may not be like one-to-one parallels here, but at least there are rough parallels and we can try to draw some contrasts. So then Krishna actually talks about that how, so the first time Krishna used the word, exclusively the word Paramatma in the 6th chapter. In the 5th chapter, he has introduced the concept of Paramatma, but he didn't use the word Paramatma in the 5th chapter. The 6th chapter, the first time in the 7th verse, Jitatmana Prashantasya Paramatma Samahitaha. He says that for one who has conquered the mind, the super soul is already reached. For he has attained tranquility. So actually, conquering the mind might be a very, very long way ahead for us, but at least we should try to control the mind, as much as possible. Conquering it means, we just have complete control over the mind. And such a person actually has already reached Paramatma. That's how Krishna puts it. And controlling the mind means the mind will shout, the mind will say a lot of things, do this, do that, but at least we should try to control in the sense, don't act on what the mind, don't listen to the mind, try to ignore the mind. So Prabhupada also uses the analogy of the lion. When we, so what happens is when we, he uses the analogy of a circus. When a circus and the ringmaster, when he has to actually control the lion, what it does is, the trick that is used is they stop feeding the lion. They just don't feed the lion. And when the daily quota of food is stopped, then what happens is the lion, it roars louder. It just roars so much louder. And if an ordinary person would be there, he would think that this lion is roaring so much, maybe it will come and eat me, let me give it food. But actually the trick is that don't feed the lion, so what happens is when lion is growling louder and roaring louder and louder, but actually it is becoming weaker and weaker. So if at that time, we just, similarly the mind also is like that. When we try to control the mind, when we don't do the things that the mind is telling us to do, the mind will shout all the more louder, do this, it will try to push us, corner us, but that the point is we have to be determined. And when we are determined and when we don't hear the mind will slowly become weaker and weaker. And then eventually the mind, when we understand that no matter how much I tell for this person to do sense gratification, he will not do sense gratification, then eventually it will come in our control. It will take very long time, but it is possible. Krishna also talks about it later, by how to control the mind. He says by detachment and by practice. These are the two things Krishna says: detachment and practice. Detachment means don't act on what mind is saying, don't do sense gratification. That is detachment. Practice means practice it. It might, we may have some fall downs. Initially the fall downs might be much greater, but over a period of time, there might be some occasional fall downs, and then finally it would be, there will be no fall downs, completely controlling the mind. That's how it is possible. Yet we see that Arjuna will give up. He will raise his hands. He say that no, it's not possible. For I can control the wind, but I cannot control my mind. Chanchala hi mana Krishna. That's how he'll put to Krishna. And therefore, Krishna will give another process. Maya asakta manaha partha yogam yunjan madashraya. And he says that make your mind attached to me. So actually, ultimately, how it works is, controlling the mind, but by our own power is very difficult, extremely difficult. There is a song also written by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. I'm missing the lyrics of the song, but he talks about that how Krishna, he is the person who gives pleasure to the mind. Rishikesha, they use the word Rishikesha. He is the one who gives pleasure to the mind and to the senses. So, if we are actually attached to Rishikesha, then only we can control our mind. So actually, we can either listen to Krishna, or we can either listen to mind. We can be the slave of Krishna, or we can be the slave of mind. There is no other choice for us in one sense. If we are not the slave of Krishna, then we definitely will be the slave of our mind. And if we are not the slave of our mind, then we have to be slave of Krishna. So both go hand in hand. And the acharyas, they give logics, they give so many different ways to prove this. And this is how it is going to happen. And we have seen it for our, either we can hear from Guru, Sadhu and Shastra. When I say slave of Krishna or servant of Krishna, it actually means the servant of Krishna and his representatives. So Guru, Sadhu and Shastra are also representatives of Krishna. So we have to be hearing, or we have to be the servants, or we have to at least take their dictation. Whatever they ask us to, we have to try to do it. Otherwise, what will happen is we'll become the servants of our mind, and the mind will. So the mind, what it does is it has the, that gravity applies for the mind also. Just tries to drag us down and down and down into sense gratification. So, and the more we go into sense gratification, the more difficult it will be for us to come up again to the spiritual platform, in a sense that, as I was saying, that when we indulge in sense gratification, then our mind becomes passionate, it becomes rajasic. And then to practice spirituality, we have to come to the platform of goodness in the sense, sattva. So if the mind is too passionate, it is too rajasic, then it is very difficult for the mind to come back to the platform of goodness. It's very increasingly difficult. And then Krishna actually gives a definition of yoga in this chapter. Jnana Vijnana Triptatma Kutastha Vijitendriya Yukta iti uchyate yogi Samaloshrama Kanchana. He says that Yukta iti uchyate yogi. So this is the third time Krishna is giving the definition of yoga. Before that, he has given it twice in the second chapter. Once he said equanimity is yoga, and then he had said yoga karma sukaushalam. The art of working is yoga. And here he is saying Yukta iti uchyate yogi. The connectedness is yoga. Connectedness in the sense connecting with the Supreme. So we have our minute consciousness, and to connect with the Supreme consciousness is called yoga, connectedness. So these three have to be understood. Here also Krishna says that, such a person is sama. Sama means he is equal. He sees everything with the same eyes, whether it be pebbles, stones, or gold. He doesn't differentiate. So Sam, Panditaha Sam Darshina. So that also applies here. Panditaha are the people who have, who are advanced in the practice of yoga. It could be Gyan Yoga, it could be Bhakti Yoga, or it could be Ashtang Yoga. So Sam Darshina, we have to attain that equanimity, the vision of equanimity. It's difficult, but it is possible. So that's how Krishna puts it. And then here, if we see, we'll come back to this verse that we were discussing, 11, 12. So now he says that to practice yoga, so he establishes first that actually this mind has to be controlled, and then what he defines also, connectedness is yoga. We have to get connected, and that connectedness will come when we are equipoised, and that equipoise, that equanimity will come when we are situated in yoga. So then he talks about how to practice yoga. So he says to practice yoga, one should go to a secluded place and should lay kusha grass on the ground and then cover it with a deer skin and a soft cloth. Now, at times people might ask, what is this, all this, you have to be on the kusha grass and then cover it with a deer skin and a soft cloth. And then the seat should not be too low or too high. Why so much, just sit and do, all you have to do is try to concentrate. But actually there are, Acharya explained that there are significance of these things. It's not that Krishna is just saying this for no reason. So he says that when Krishna says that actually it should not be too low. So basically what happens is when the yogi is trying to practice, when he's trying to fix the mind, because he is isolated in a solitary forest, there would be some worms, insects that would be there, and they would want to, feast on that yogi. So what would happen is if they would come and they would try to feast on the yogi might get disturbed. His consciousness might get disturbed. So therefore it has to be a little, up from the ground. It should not be too low. And it should not be too high also. Why? Because if the yogi attains trance, then, he might actually fall down. We see that in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, several times it happens that, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu goes in trance and then he falls down. And then, of course, he's standing and he's going into trance. Such a, advanced stage. He is not even trying to fix his mind on Krishna. Just any little stimuli that reminds him of Krishna, he just goes into trance. He is so connected with Krishna. And there are certain other devotees also. I'm missing the name of. There's one devotee. He just sees the peacock fan, and then that reminds him of Krishna, and then he just goes into trance and he practically falls down. So the point is that they should not fall down flat on the ground if they are in trance. So it should not be too high also. And then why deer skin? The Acharya explained that deer skin, not the deer, but the deer skin has a property that it repels snakes. In the forest, there are a lot of snakes. There are pythons, and at those times there are big pythons, not small pythons, very, very big pythons. So deer skin has a property that it repels the snakes. The snakes wouldn't want to come near the deer skin, not the deer themselves. At times pythons would try to swallow the deer also. But after the deer has left the body and the skin has been taken out, that skin has that property. Somehow it catches that property. So this is actually, important in that sense. And then he should sit on it very firmly and practice yoga to purify the heart by controlling his mind, senses, and activities and fixing the mind on one point. So here Krishna actually talks about yogam atma vishuddhaye. So the idea is with yoga he has to purify himself. The yogi has to purify himself. So this has come earlier also in the 5th chapter. Yoginaha karma kurvanti sangam tyaktva atma shuddhaye. So why do the yogis work? They want to give up attachment and they want to purify themselves. Sangam tyaktva means to give up attachment, and atma shuddhaye means self-purification. They work for the purpose of self-purification. And here also he is saying yogam atma vishuddhaye, for clarifying the heart through the yoga practice. So now we don't have much time left, but I wanted to quickly talk about the yama and niyamas. So the Sri Sampradaya Acharyas, they actually explain. There is a commentary that is written, I believe, on the Yoga Sutras also by one of the Acharyas. So they explain that so there are different kinds of yogas. Actually, we have the uh, Patanjali yoga is the most prominent, but we also have Raj yoga, we also have Kundalini yoga. So they basically deal with the same thing, but they focuses on different things. So now Patanjali yoga is the most famous, and Patanjali is actually a rishi. So the Sri Sampradaya Acharya explained that actually this Patanjali was a Vaishnava himself. He was an incarnation of Shesha. He was not an ordinary person. So his Patanjali Yoga Sutras are mostly very well accepted. So now, interestingly, when so one of the niyamas is Ishwar Pranidhan. Ishwar Pranidhan means surrender to Ishwar. So interestingly, he doesn't say who Ishwar is. He doesn't say either Krishna or Shiva or Vishnu or Brahma. He doesn't talk about. He just says Ishwar Pranidhan, because in that context, it is understood who Ishwara is. And Krishna will also say that later. In the next verse itself, Krishna will introduce that actually the perfection of yoga is actually a person who he can meditate on me. In the next verse he will clarify that. So now out of the 8 limbs, the first 2 are yama and niyama. So yamas are the don'ts, the things that should not be done, and niyamas are things that should be done. For us also, we have yama and niyamas. We have the 4 regulative principles, things that we should not do, and then we have the niyamas also, things that we should do. So we say that we have the ABCD of the bhakti. So we have A is association, B is book, C is chanting, and D is DT. Or diet also, some people say it is diet, not DT, whatever. DT is also important, diet is also very important. So those are the do's. So these are the ways in which bhakti can flourish. Similarly, niyamas are those things with which the yoga can flourish. It can, they are like the catalysts. So, and yamas are things which will destroy the yogas. So, if we indulge in those 4 regulative principles, then actually it is mentioned in the nectar of instruction that it will destroy the Bhakti Lata Bij. So similarly, yama and niyamas apply to all the parts. So it applies to us also. So now in their case, they have 5 yamas. There is ahimsa, satya, asteya, brahmacharya, and aparigraha. Krishna will talk about brahmacharya in the next verse, that how complete abstinence from sex life. Now, Prabhupada also writes elsewhere that in the Bhakti school, the Grahastha Brahmacharis are accepted. It's very interesting. He says Grahastha Brahmachari. Grahastha Brahmachari means people who have taken the vow of, only, intimately associating with their spouses and not with anyone outside the marriage. But in the other schools, Prabhupada writes that there is complete abstinence is required. So that's how you explain later. But ahimsa, now there are benefits also for following these yamas and niyamas. So in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, Patanjali gives the benefits. If one follows these yamas and niyamas, each of these yama and niyama, they give certain benefits. So he says that if we follow ahimsa, which is a yama, others will give up hinsa for you. If you don't do violence against others, others will give up violence, and that includes even the other living entities like insects and animals and others. Then satya is always speaking the truth. If we speak if we always speak the truth, our words will become true. Whatever we speak, it will become true. We see that at times, some elevated rishis, and we see the past times that they curse certain people, and those curses will come true. How do they come true? They do come true because they never speak lies. And when they don't speak lies, their words have potency, and whatever they speak, that will come true. So that is the power of speaking satya. Then asteya is not stealing, not encroaching on the properties of others. And if a person follows asteya, Patanjali explains that true wealth will come to that person. True wealth is the wealth of Krishna, And then he talks about brahmacharya. If one follows brahmacharya, so what happens is through brahmacharya, person gets purity and he gets power. Prabhupada used to say purity is the force. So it is the force which pushes us on the right path. So brahmacharya will give powers. Later he'll also talk about, now these could be yogic powers or they could be transcendental powers. Yogic powers are not necessarily transcendental. There are yogic siddhis which are considered to be material at times. Then aparigraha is non-possessiveness. So if a person follows non-possessiveness, Patanjali explains that actually such a person will get insights into the working of law of karma. Now for us it is very difficult. Krishna says karma gahana karmano gati. Gahana means it's very difficult to understand the how the karma works. So how the karma works, if a person does aparigraha, then he will get the insight. So at times we see in the scriptures that there would be some saints, they would come that, oh, you are suffering this because you have done this in your past. So how are they able to say that? Because they can understand that this is because you have done this, that's why it is happening. So they get insights into the working of the law of karma. So these are the benefits of following the yamas. Similarly, there are 5 niyamas: Shaucha, Santosha, Tapa, Swadhyay, and Ishwar Pranidhan. So Patanjali actually talks about what are the benefits of following these niyamas. So Shaucha means cleanliness, keeping the place where we are clean and keeping our body clean. So he says that if one follows Shaucha, the person will become detached from the body. Very interesting. So how it works is, when we try to keep the body clean, we will realize how unclean the body is, and we'll realize that actually we are not the body, we are the soul. So the detachment from body will come if we try to stay clean. Santosha is becoming basically satisfaction through whatever material circumstances we are. At times material circumstances are very trying. So he said that if one follows Santosha and whatever material circumstances are there, he just tries to be satisfied, then he will get Sukha. Sukha is not just Sukha means happiness, and it's not just material happiness. He says that he will get spiritual happiness, in the sense that he will be able to progress further, and because of his spiritual progress, he will get spiritual happiness. Tapa is austerities, and by doing different austerities, the yogi will get the yogic siddhis. So we know the different siddhis. We don't have time to discuss those right now. Then there is Swadhyay. Swadhyay is the study of scriptures. And then it is explained by Patanjali that by doing Swadhyay, the connectedness with God will improve, because the scriptures, they are the words of God, and they talk about God. They talk about his personality, his activities, his dealings with his devotees. All those are mentioned in the scriptures. So by doing Swadhyay, his connectedness with God will improve, and he will be able to connect very well with the God. And Ishwar Pranidhan, surrender to Ishvara, this actually will lead to Samadhi. So they are progressive, and it's not that you can just do Ishwar Pranidhan and not do the others, because even others are very important niyamas. So Ishwar Pranidhan is what will lead to Samadhi ultimately. When we do Ishwar Pranidhan, when the yogi does Ishwar Pranidhan, surrender to Ishvara, then the absorption in Ishvara, basically for the yogis, the Ishvara that they meditate on is the Paramatma in the heart. So their absorption in Paramatma will improve, and then they will be able to get into the Samadhi stage. So with that, I just stop here, and then let's see, we just have 5 more minutes left. So I want to see if there are any questions or corrections or comments about what we discussed today. Any questions, corrections, comments? Okay. There are no questions or comments. Did someone say something?
No, I was about to say that the science behind the deer skin. This is the first time I'm listening to that. But earlier I had a question like why yogis use this deer skin or tiger skin, kind of.
I have not heard tiger skin so much in the scriptures. I think Krishna talks about deer skin, I believe. So did you read anywhere tiger skin also?
No, I heard from some people, I mean from some friends.
Okay. Yeah, so there are pictures. I have also seen those pictures, of especially of Lord Shiva sitting on a tiger skin. But at least I have not come across any anywhere in the scriptures that the yogis would sit on tiger skin. Okay, all right. If there are no other questions or comments or corrections, then we can stop here. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining. Vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhyabhya eva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Ananta koti vaishnav वृंद की जय. भगवत गीता की जय. श्रील प्रभुपाद की जय. हरे कृष्णा.